and welcome to AL TV and to Security Update. As always, our host is David Otto from Global Risk International, the man who understands everything about security, global terrorism. You ask him, he's got answers. But today or this evening, he has again he's got a collective of knowledgeable people about this matter, global terrorism, security, as I've already said. He's going to introduce to you people that he has gotten together today. So, David, please take away your.
Good evening. Thank you, Mr. Joseph. We want to appreciate African television for this week program on African security audit. This program is going to be quite one of the most interesting, if not most interesting, programs that we've done for the past weeks, because we're looking at the civil-military relationship. In terms of how the military interact with the civilian population when it comes to counter-insurgency operations in Africa, counter-insurgencies in Europe and others. So for us to do that, we would also mention areas that relate to the mandate of the terrorists. How terrorist organizations and individuals, how they, and part of the modus operandi that should be considered when we're initiating a counter-insurgency program. But also we look at how individuals within the local communities, how the local population can protect itself from terrorist activity. How can you defend yourself when there is a terrorist attack? Because we know that these local populations take the brunt of a terrorist incident. So we've got experts to talk about, give you some ideas as to how you can defend yourself in a scenario that involves a terrorist activity or any other criminal activity. So today we've got three important guests with huge experience in this area. And, we would bring in Brigadier General Sani Usman, who is the former acting director of the Nigerian Army. He's been in the military since 1983. He retired just recently in 2019 as I said, as a spokesperson of the Nigerian Army. He's got more than 30 years of experience in the Nigerian military at a very, very top level. And, he's been engaged in the fight against one of the most deadliest terrorist organizations in the world. That's the Islamic State of West African Province and Boko Haram. So he's got a huge experience, in terms of, now being a civilian and previously being at the very top of the Nigerian military. He's traveled worldwide. So he's got experience from different countries, and he's going to share with us today what he thinks about the engagement with the local population and the military, and how the military is now trying to adapt itself into a horizontal or asymmetric warfare. So we'll be talking to Brigadier General Sani Usman Kukasheka, about this particular aspect. And then we will also bring in our very able Hanif Kadi, who is a former Al-Qaeda member. Hanif is going to talk to you about the mindset of a terrorist. He is one of those individuals who began a de-radicalization program in the United Kingdom, on the platform of Active Change Foundation. He's done a lot of work on de-radicalizing some of the most what I call the most ideologically driven terrorists that, he's come across. And with his experience being a member of Al-Qaeda and reforming to become one of the most respected violent extremist consultants, he has a lot of experience, and he's going to focus a lot on what is happening in the UK, what happens in Africa, because he's got experience in Africa as well. He's been to the Sahel, where he's brought in a lot of programs to do with violent extremism and counter-violent extremism, within governments and other kinds of organizations. So we will be talking to Hanif Kadi on that. And most importantly, how do people protect themselves, when there is an attack? How do you protect yourself as a civilian? Because terrorists are there to target you. And that is why we brought in today Mr. Olado Madna, who has a huge experience, in the International Bodyguards and Security Service Association, IBBSS, and he's been talking to a lot of countries. He's been to the Caribbean, talking to governments. He's been to Europe, talking to government to Eastern Europe. He's also been to Africa, and he's got a huge experience in terms of how people can protect themselves. Mind you, Mr. Orlando Martner is also now becoming very, very, shortly, I think, he will become a certified anti-terrorism specialist, because, he's going to be looking at how the link between terrorists and the Bodyguard Association, how they can combine some of their efforts, looking at methodologies of attacks and protection. So these are the three most important individuals of today. So please pay attention to what they say. If you've got questions, I've received some of your questions already. I'll be giving them these questions to give you as much answers as they can. But let me start with you, Brigadier General Sani Usman. You've been in the Nigerian Army, just recently retired, in 2019, and at the moment, the Nigerian Army is engaged with the most brutal terrorist organization in the world. You've served not just in Nigeria, but you've served out of Nigeria as well. I mean, you can talk about the Nigerian Army during the time of the ECOMOG, with Sierra Leone. Nigerian Army has served in most African countries as peacekeeping missions. You've been at the very top. How do you see the Boko Haram crisis and the relationship that the military has with the population? And what is your experience now that you're a civilian?
Well, I think the experience is a mixture of a sort, in the sense that whenever you're talking about these issues, you have to look at the history of terrorism and insurgency in Nigeria, how it evolved, and the steps taken over time. Now, this issue has been with us for 10 years now. The first 10 years, the first 5 years, it's more or less like there was lack of sense of direction, because there was no, consensus as to what exactly is the problem. But within the last 5 years, I think we were able to put a finger to the problem, in the sense that it is not the routine issues that we are used to, because we have had violent extremism in the country over the years. Take, for instance, in the 1980s, we had the Metesine religious uprising. We have had others in Bulunkutu and so many other parts of the country that were successfully dealt with. But this time around, it was an ideological one. So without understanding, and even the society where it emanated from, they thought more or less like it's a routine thing. They regard them as their children, so they couldn't give the right advice and have the right perspective with it. Now, that has been overtaken with time and events, because truly, over time, they have shown beyond all reasonable doubt that they are unrelenting, and they are so determined to the point that they even set up a caliphate that was dismantled, carving out territory, a large chunk of the northeastern part of the country. Now, so the reaction towards that varies. Initially the military action, but now it is total. There is a better understanding. But then again, when you are dealing with it, there are issues of collateral damage and other interest groups that you have to look at. How do you deal with the issue of, protecting civilian, innocent people, human rights issues, and what have you? So the whole gamut of these things are being taken into the stride. And thankfully, I think a lot of progress has been made as compared to those years when they held territories, but now there are isolated cases.
Thank you very much, General. I think you've made a very good point. A lot of progress has been made. And so do you agree that in the world, talking about the United States of America, very few countries have learned how to combat terrorism using the military, because it's not just the military alone that can defeat terrorism. how has the Nigerian military been able to adapt to a warfare that initially they were not trained for?
Yeah, we were able to adapt because, given the, threat analysis that we have. And I told you that it's basically ideological. Therefore, even though they mingle with the Nigerian society, especially where they domicile. Before they were chased out of Maiduguri, particularly in Gwange area, where they had their headquarters, where it was a no-go area. So you have to find a way of dealing with it, at the same time dealing with the criminal elements of them. But now they have moved out of town. It's more or less like issue of conventional warfare, even though it was more or less like guerrilla warfare, because the enemy is not well defined, except when he engage you or you come across him. And the truth is that various models have been adopted, and eventually we have to evolve our own local model given the prevailing circumstances and the fact that Nigerian society is unique, because you cannot identify a Boko Haram terrorist outrightly unless, of course, if you come across him or her, as the case may be, or when they confess to you. So automatically you have a problem, unlike the issue of fighting in build-up areas, you engage a particular target and what have you. But by and large, those things have been taken into consideration in the doctrine and the tactics of the military to the point of where we are now.
Yeah, but now that's a good point. But another one more point before I get to Hanif Kadib. How has the Nigerian army been able to build rapport with the civilian population that it is helping to fight this war, taking into consideration that the army cannot succeed without having intelligence from the community? You made it very clear that you cannot identify a member of Boko Haram just like that. You need intelligence from the community. Now, the Nigerian army has been accused that they've been very hard-handed with the civilian population. But what have you guys done that you're succeeding now in getting intelligence from the community?
Well, first and foremost, the issue of sincerity of purpose. Just like I told you earlier on, there was total confusion and lack of understanding. There were so many interest groups. In fact, even the community, which was the epicenter of the Boko Haram terrorists, they were thinking that they were more or less like their children, therefore they could be able to talk with them. But eventually, when they started killing people, even prominent people, they realized the magnitude of the problem. Because initially the military was ostracized and all the rest of the thing, being accused of so many things. And of course there was heavy propaganda, that people tend to buy that the military were high-handed. But when it was made known to them that the military was there to protect them for their overall interest, and of course, particularly when Lieutenant General Tukur Yusuf Buratai came on board, that he mingled with the soldiers, eat with them, go on patrol with them, and of course, having come from that area, understanding the terrain, they were able to trust and respect him, and were able to leverage on that. And the people tend to understand and become more cooperative, and realizing the fact that, yes, there are certain instances you can take steps to protect yourself, but there is limit to that extent, because the military has to do its job. And with that, they were to be the issue of discipline or abuse of human rights were equally investigated. And in fact, we opened up communication channels to the point that we have human rights desks, telephone services where people can call and, complain. And whenever there is complaint, there is always follow-up. Then most importantly, bulk of the complaint of the people earlier on was that even if they give information, it was not acted upon. And even if they act on it, sometimes they reveal the identity of the person that gives out such information. So we assured the people that by acting timely and accurately with the information provided, by following it up, and at the same time protecting the identity of the people. And with that, it gave them a lot of confidence and sense of belonging that they relate very well with the military and provide information, and the military kept on, acting on it to the point of where we are now.
Okay. I think I'll come back to you and I'll talk to you about some of the, because I would like to hear your point on some of the challenges which the military is facing at the moment. Because of course you've got Boko Haram and so-called bandits operating within the northwest regions of Nigeria. But of course, then you've got the regional crisis which you've got in Mali, linked to the Al-Qaeda in Mali. You've got problems in Niger Republic, in Cameroon, in Chad. So I'll get you to talk about the regional collaboration aspect. How you can connect that. But let me get to Hanif Kadi, because the reason why I bring Hanif Kadi at this point is because Hanif Kadi is somebody who continues to do a lot of work on de-radicalization, continues to do a lot of work on civil engagement, how the population, the local communities can engage with the police, how they can engage with non-state organizations, community-based organizations like the organization that you run, Hanif, the ACF. You are a member of Al-Qaeda, and you know the mindset of a terrorist. You've been there. You're now one of the most respected counter-extremist consultants. Now, you've heard what General Usman has said about the way that terrorist organizations operate. They mingle with the society. What is your experience? I mean, remember that Boko Haram originally began somewhere around 2000, 2001. I mean, that's when they began, proliferating in northern Nigeria. It's the same time when Al-Qaeda, launched the 9/11 attacks. So you've got both of these organizations having some links, and you were part of this organization. What is your experience? I want you to talk to us about the mindset of a terrorist.
So, well, first of all, thank you for having me on, David. It's a pleasure to meet you guys and to be part of this discussion and debate. It's a very important discussion, as David, you rightly know, and you all know, the evolution and the evolving nature of this threat and the challenge it poses on societies and communities is growing. And from the mindset of the Boko Haram and ISWAP is very similar. Obviously, they have similar traits and similar ideologies and similar goals in mind. And the only way that they can operate is in places where there is a lack of governance. The communities are where society is being hard done by, or they feel they are being hard done by, like in Afghanistan. There's been conflict throughout most of the history of that country. Similarly, in Central Asia and South Asia, and in Africa as well, where you have a lot of lack of governance, where there is corruption that's taking root, and it's at the high level where the average person feels that the state is not acting in the best interests of the people. That's where terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram and so forth, that's where they will find that they can set their roots and they can grow from there. They look at the grievances of society and people, the vulnerabilities, the difficulties, and they come in just like they've always done, and they exploit those situations. They know that the only response that is going to be militarily, and that's what they're relying on. Because the more the military gets involved, and I'm not saying that the military shouldn't get involved, and you probably learned that from what the brigadier has been saying, is that in the first 5 years you struggled to get to come to terms with how to deal with the nature and the ideology of this threat and the network. Is they rely on the governments or other external governments to come in with the firepower and the military and to start fighting. That's what they're relying on. And through that, they can, it suits their purpose, it suits the way of operation, and it allows them to prove again the fact that the state is not acting in the best interests of the people. Because, like you said, Brigadier, is your concern had been collateral damage. And it's just like when we had the Iraq war and the Afghan invasion. When the Allied forces went in, they didn't look at the collateral damage. They were looking at chasing the terrorists. And in that process, more civilians got killed than terrorists. I would say it was like 10 to 1, 10 civilians to 1 terrorist. So the more civilians get killed and the more they become displaced, the argument that they've been making is then, it becomes credible, because now you've demonstrated that, in fact, the state has only one way of dealing with it. So it allows them to grow, it allows their narrative to set in, and then from there, they can deepen their roots. And the ideology that comes with it, it's like we've always been saying, and I'm not one of those people that would say, oh, Islam is not the problem, or the ideological underpinnings is Islam. They will use anything. They will use Christianity. They will use whatever they can. In this case, they use Islam as a vehicle to carry their message. And they use the defensive or the historical text from the Quran about warfare and about, operating with with the disbelievers or those who work with the disbelievers. And it's like exploiting the situation that the average person is experiencing. So this is the way that they operate. This is how they manipulate the situation, and this is how that their voice carries by using certain vehicles in certain situations. Don't forget, you can operate in communities just like they can, but when you've got a uniform, or when you represent the state, you are going into ungoverned spaces that you haven't been in before. So the idea of an extremist or a terrorist is to work within the environment that is hard to govern. And where there's lack of governance anyway, it becomes much more easier for them. And then they will adapt to the circumstances, they will adapt to the situation. Like the military or like any kind of law enforcement agency adapts to the situation, they're always a step ahead. And this is the way that they think. So setting up roots in Africa has been it's been in the making for many, many years. And the way that in the African states we've been dealing with the threat has actually worked in favor of the terrorists. And it continues to work in the favor of the terrorists as long as we use military as the only option.
Yeah, let me ask you 2 questions on that. You talked about the lack of, governance. Now, how do you relate that to the UK, where you've got terrorists, with a relatively good governance system? What do you explain the driving factors behind that? And also, having you is very important for the audience. What is the difference between Al Qaeda and ISIS? Besides, of course, we know that they've got the same ideology, but what is the real difference between Al Qaeda and ISIS?
So the first question about the UK, about the UK having a good governance system. Well, look, in the UK, we haven't had the situation where we've got groups like we've got in South Asia, like in Afghanistan or Iraq or in Syria, where they've set up base, they've got a whole army there, or in Africa. Here, all across the world, including the UK, these are grounds, these are recruiting grounds. Okay, and whenever there's a situation of look, the Black Lives Matter movement is also being exploited currently, and that's being used in places like UK, in Europe, in America, is because they look at the sense of vulnerabilities and the sense of grievances that people have around the world about their state and about the state of affairs within their communities and how they're being how they've been treated and the experiences they've gone through as maybe a black African or a black Afro-Caribbean or an Asian Muslim or as a Muslim per se, and how they've been. So they look at those grievances. So the UK and Europe, these are ideal recruiting grounds because of the experiences that people have been exposed to from racism and all this kind of stuff, and Islamophobia and all this. Now, the difference between Al-Qaeda and ISIS, they would say, so each of them would argue, Al-Qaeda would argue that they are completely, they are the Khawarij. Those are the extremist renegades that don't follow the book in accordance to how it's been commanded to us to, for the sanctity of life and all this. And ISIS will argue that they are not taking it far enough because we cannot trust this and we cannot do this. So they would say we are worlds apart, where in actual fact, there are differences. And it's a good question, but it's also a very difficult one to answer in a clear way. And I will try to do my best. Is Al-Qaeda would say we don't deliberately target the minorities or the innocent women and children. And ISIS would say, well, if they are not part of, if they don't convert to Islam, if they don't accept our way of thinking and live under our rule, then they need to be killed. So there are two arguments. Both of them both of them can go deeper, and both of them have a grounding, but they don't have legitimacy in the context that they argue them. Does that make sense?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
So when Al-Qaeda says, but we don't deliberately kill innocent civilians, well, actual fact, they do. And sometimes they use they use children. Al-Qaeda in particular has used young children to become suicide bombers. Now you're using the innocent children to further your own objective, whereas Islam, there is no ruling for that. There is no grounding for that. In fact, there is a condemnation about that. ISIS will say, if you don't accept our way, our laws and our rules, then you're going to get killed, or you live under our rules and accept that. And if you're a Muslim, then you have to accept our version of Islam. There is not, like I said, there is no compulsion within Islam, and you have to protect the minority. So both of their arguments, they don't have legitimacy, and they fall by the wayside for those people who know. But for those who don't, they're compelled to then either join one or the other.
I think it's a good question. Thank you for that. Let me, before I get to Mr. Orlando, let me ask you one more question. We're talking about civil and military relationship. You've got an experience from outside and an experience from inside.
Yeah.
What would ISIS not want the local population to do that would jeopardize their battle of hearts and minds? I mean, how would you advise a government or advise the military to engage with the local civilians in such a way that they can maintain the trust that they need?
Okay, very good point. And I got the right answer for that. Now, in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, it can work very easily. We tried it in the UK and it worked, but it wouldn't have worked. I mean, it wouldn't work as well as it would work in Africa, Nigeria, for instance, or in Pakistan or in Afghanistan. And that the UK came up with a model which we helped come up with one of my trustees, Chris Donnelly. It was called Army in Society. So we got our young men and women from different backgrounds, and we engaged with the military. So we went to the military the Defense Academy. We went to the barracks, we went to the Lake Districts, we went to the shooting ranges, and the military supported some of our youth activities and our adventurous training in civil uniform, in their normal clothes. So the individuals got to know them afterwards, about 3 days later, that who they are and where they're from and what's their background. And it worked very well because what it did, it allowed them to see the human face of their perceived enemy. But in places like Pakistan where we worked, and we've got the military and we've got the intelligence agencies who were seen as the enemy by Al-Qaeda, we got them to work within society to help them to talk to young people, encourage them to help and rebuild the state, or let's apply effective governance structures. So what is the problems? And that wasn't from us, it was from the military that they said, look, we appreciate We use the arguments that Al Qaeda or ISWAP will use against you. So we use those arguments in society. What is your problem? Do you have a problem with water, with schooling, with the governance, with corruption? Help us. Come and be part of us. Work with us, and we will work with you. That's the only way. That's the biggest threat to Boko Haram, is when you start to engage with their target audience, with the people who they want to exploit or they want to recruit. When you start to take away the human resource, because don't forget, this is the biggest weapon against anybody.
Yeah.
Human resource. So you have to engage with that human resource and deny them the space or deny them the opportunity to take away the community, the human resource to use against you or the state. So the state needs to work with society to deny extremists and terrorists the human resource that they need to survive.
Yeah, I think it's a perfect way of putting it, because it's all about alternative arguments and alternative action, alternative engagement. Once the state engages the most vulnerable people that the Islamic State or Boko Haram or Al Qaeda or Al Shabaab is trying to target, then what happens is they lose that battle of engaging those individuals. So you eventually win them. I mean, that's a very good method, and I thank you very much for that. Now, let's go to the most important part, which is talking about, the population itself. I mean, if Al Qaeda or Boko Haram or ISWAP has the ideology, and you send in the military or you send in the civil society organizations, at the end of the day, if they don't carry out attacks, then nothing happens. There's a win-win. So what we're looking at now is looking at recent attacks that have happened in London, looking at attacks that recently happened in Reading as well. We've seen attacks which have happened in Glasgow and in Nigeria, in Somalia. We've seen all sorts of attacks, and the question is, how do civilians protect themselves or predict these attacks? How do you fight? How do you defend yourself? At what point do you decide to run away? At what point do you decide to hide? So, I think that is why I've been Mr. Orlando Gardner, who's got a huge experience in this. And he also understands how terrorist organizations operate. So, Mr. Orlando, I mean, you've got an experience in this area. And if you're advising people or organizations that are vulnerable to this kind of attacks, what would you be saying to them in the first place?
Okay, well, if it's organizations, it's one thing. If it's civilians, it's another. Organizations need to come together and put a plan together, some sort of an operational plan in response to situations that could arise. So some sort of an organizational resilience plan within, with that in mind, to be able to operate within, when situations do occur. Now, when we look at the different attacks that have happened in London, and we all know it's asymmetric. So there's no timing of such to say, okay, then when we go down the road, it will happen. So we then respond.
Yeah.
So this is where we have to think, okay, we have to look at the situations that can arise at any time. And as organizations, plans need to be put in place, as in staff should know what to do. They should know how to shut down or to divide their buildings or know what to do and where people can be safe or where people can go to be safe. From an individual perspective, obviously, the first thing they need, if it's a knife or weapon or firearms attack, different response to a certain degree. If it's firearms, you have to get away and take cover. Take cover behind something that can maybe withstand the bullet. But getting away and running away from that situation is your first protocol. Hide would be your second, and then trying to get in touch with the police or calling, authorities and letting them know where you are, how many suspects there are, their location, what they're wearing, that sort of the who, what, where, why, when, sort of a scenario. So that's from an individual perspective and a firearms perspective. Getting away is your first protocol. Now we have vulnerable people sometimes that can't get away. So we have to in a situation where there's terrorism, we have to think about ourselves in a sense. If we can help people to get away and to run away, fine enough. If we hide, fine enough. But if vulnerable people are there and that you can't help them, we have to leave them. And that's just the raw end of that situation. But from an organization perspective, it's a little bit of a different approach to asymmetric threat. And from a civilian perspective, it's getting away. From a knives are something that we can't defend against. You will always be injured. So no matter what you do going forward, where a knife attack is concerned, the most you can do is try to get away, try to use something to.
Yeah, did we lose Mr. Orlando there?
I think we lost him there.
Yeah, let's just give it a second. I don't know if Mr. Orlando is there, but he was making some very important points about when you're confronted with a knife, what kind of measures you should take into consideration, making it very clear that people should try and get away as quickly as possible, because knife attacks would always lead you, or possibly lead you, to being injured. I think we've lost Mr. Orlando Madna there. But let me go back to Brigadier General Usman. General, we were talking about some of the difficulties that the military faces in engaging terrorists in an asymmetric environment. And so one of the things which I want us to, you to really, give to light is, what are some of the, you spoke about the challenge already, but what are the key challenges that, you left when you were a spokesperson for the Nigerian, in terms of the communication between the military and the civilian population, that communication, how did you build that communication and how is it now?
Well, I think the starting point was my experience while I was in 1 Division Nigerian Army. That time, way back 2012 to 2014, rolling out from the northeast, they were inching towards the northwest and trying to make Kaduna as one of their staging center or even headquarters. And we denied them. But part of the way we did was engaging the community. Apart from interpersonal communication and the media and the rest, we above what we call stakeholders, security meeting. Engaging the various strata of the Nigerian society residing in Kaduna and environ. And this came about because of Easter bombing, in which they were targeting a church that was was filled up with about 3,000 worshippers. But because of the checkpoints and the timing, it blew up along the way. And 21 innocent persons lost their lives, including, newspaper vendors, motorcyclists and what have you. Now, with that, we leveraged on that and told the public that, look, the Boko Haram terrorists is against everybody. They are not selective. And unless you cooperate, we cannot be able to deal with this issue. So building on that experience, and they cooperated very well, and that is how we deny them freedom of action in Kaduna. And you may think as if it is a job, but the truth is that they were even building houses and concealing, bombs in them, waiting for the right time to strike. and what have you. So building on that experience, when I became the Director of Army Public Relations, we had to leverage on it, particularly in the Northeast. And just like Hanif has said, the most important thing is the human resource that they deal with. And we made extensive use of the media to really show the public what Boko Haram stands for, exposing them, tagging them, the criminals they are, rapists, murderers, robbers, that their ideology had nothing to do with Islam. With that, people tend to relax and cooperate with us. And just like I mentioned earlier, they wanted to see what the military will do, demonstrating beyond all reasonable doubt that actually, yes, the military is better than the Boko Haram terrorists who had been, telling them all sorts of things, building kind of castle in the air, creating an impression that if you die, you will straight go to heaven and all the rest of the thing. And of course, I kept on asking them the question, if you want to go to heaven, if you wish good for somebody, why won't you wish it for yourself? Why don't you go kill yourself and go to heaven first? Why should you use somebody's child and all the rest? So we dealt with those issues, engaging even, in the segment of the society, particularly the opinion leaders and all the rest. And along the line, it trickled down to the ordinary person and shown beyond reasonable doubt that we have the capacity to engage and protect. But beyond that, again, we had to embark on humanitarian projects. Areas that were liberated and all the rest, we were able to, with limited resources, to bring back infrastructure and social services. Take, for instance, the educational system. There was intervention, soldiers teaching in school, constructing schools, and of course, giving out, skills to the most vulnerable, women, loans, and all the rest of the thing. And that gives them great sense of belonging, and they tend to, be at home with the public. The one important aspect, when areas that have been held by the Boko Haram were, recaptured, we engaged the public. I could remember in Gambarungala, just a border town with protocol in Cameroon, for the past 3 years, they were seeing, it was just a river that divided Nigeria and Cameroon in that area. Less than 500 meters, you are seeing somebody occupying your house, doing all sorts of things, but nobody has talked to them. So by the time we reached there, we not only spoke with them, we spoke in their own language. It gave them sense of belonging and all what have you, and demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt this is really their army that is ready to sacrifice and make them, safe and secure. So there are so many steps that were taken to win the hearts and mind of the people, even though the terrorists were not relenting in their effort to make sure that they undo what we have always been doing. You understand?
Yeah. Let me ask one question before Mr. Joseph asks a question. In terms of the, I'll come back to you, Mr. Orlando, because, I've got a question on you in terms of situational awareness. So think about that. Brigadier, in terms of the interagency approach, between the military and other agencies, my experience is that the military alone cannot do the job, because you need the help of other sister agencies. You need the help of the Nigerian police. You need the help of the Air Force or the Navy. You need the help of regional states, because Boko Haram is not, of course, it began in Nigeria, but it's no longer a Nigerian problem. And of course, you have the multinational joint task force, which is there, to serve for that purpose. What is the relationship between interagencies, but also with regional partners? Is this relationship healthy?
Well, it is not. My answer, disappointingly, will not be yes or no. But what I'm trying to say, I quite agree with you, and of course, you got it right in the sense that the fight against terrorism and insurgency is a collective responsibility. It is not the sole responsibility.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Did we lose him there? Okay, while we're waiting for him to get back, Mr. Joseph, I'm sure you were going to ask him a question. So what I'll do is I'll get back to Mr. Orlando Madna, who is there before bringing Hanif. Orlando, I want you to, because you were already giving some very important points on defending yourself against a possible knife attack. Of course, you've seen that in the recent attack in Reading, where about 3 people were killed. You've seen the same situation in Glasgow. What is your? I mean, you do a lot of training on situational awareness. What would you advise the public on how people go to packs? I mean, has time changed in these types of activities?
Thank you for welcoming me. Time has changed, and that's a sad thing to say. Things have changed, but the problem that I have recognized within society a lot is, although time is changing, we're still following almost in a lag behind the time that is moving. We have a situation, we have the threat at the moment as substantial, something that it is likely to happen. But yet still people will still go out, go for a walk, going home from work without much planning or without much attention to them, to where they're going or, how they're going to get there, and just going as like a wind blowing a paper bag, if you want to put it that bluntly. And this is some of the issues that the society has, and that needs to be smartened up or sharpened up about. With the situation as it is across the world as it is, we need to be able to start thinking more about where we're going, how we're going to get there. And when we're sitting down and looking around, or when we're choosing somewhere to go or choosing somewhere to be aware of where we are, be aware of the people around us. If it as the old saying, if it walks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, it is a duck. So we have to pay attention to the things around us and see how it behaves, what it looks like, see almost some level of a profiling of our surroundings and people around us. And in doing so and practicing doing so every day, we can see something happening in at least a few seconds. Give yourself that couple of seconds to get away from the situation, to hide from the situation, and to get help. As quick as possible. And that's all we really need. A lot of the times when situations do happen, it's just that majority of the people that were there were not aware at all. We're totally oblivious to the situation around them.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that. I mean, it's a very good point. Let me get to Hanif. Hanif, I need to ask you this, because the Islamic State apparently has lost its its so-called caliphate. Physically, I think, in terms of their ideology, it is still there. Most of their foreign fighters who left different countries and joined the Islamic State have gone back to these countries. A lot of them have gone to Africa. A lot of them have, sleeper cells in Europe, in the Middle East, and in different areas. Now there is this issue of children, of the offsprings of members of the Islamic State and some of their families. How do we deal with them? Because a lot of countries have abandoned their families in Syria, in Iraq, because they cannot handle them. You've talked about this, but how does a government deal with returning foreign fighters? Because this is an ongoing issue.
So, regards to ISIS, the caliphate, it wasn't, the caliphate has never been about land or, a particular area. It's been about the idea. And because they had this idea and it managed to manifest and achieve some successes in their worldview. And now we see that, okay, they've lost their land, they've lost their leadership, they've lost thousands and thousands of fighters, and they're almost destroyed. What has happened as a result of that and the lack of appreciation of the ideology and the mindset has now allowed the ISIS brand to continue and to be reborn, maybe under a different name, because of the because our lack of collective efforts and a lack of appreciation of the factors that exist on the ground. So, for instance, all of these guys that are left in the children and the wives and some of the others that are left in Syria and Iraq, and the governments are worried about bringing them back, and they're left in those refugee camps. That is the when you say that is us allowing the rebirth of the next wave of ISIS, maybe under a different name, under different leadership, but much more intent on causing us damage. Why? Because we diminished our responsibilities towards the human side of things. Now, we know very well that young women have been groomed. Why did we have the prevent or the counter violent extremism programs in place in the first place? To protect vulnerable people. And we also know that vulnerable people have been lost and have slipped through the net and have been recruited, like the Shabima Begums and others from across the world that have went to Syria or Iraq. Now, a lot of them have gone there, and they've in their early teens, they've now become, more mature, more older in their ways, and more wiser to the situation. And they may have regretted their travel and their journey in the first place, but they couldn't escape because of the circumstances surrounding them. But it might have been a welcome call that ISIS has been so brutally broken away that their hopes and aspirations of returning back to their parents or to their families or to their home countries have been hit so hard that the country that they want to come back has now forgotten them. Even though there are some amongst them that are hardened, with the ideology of ISIS and want to cause damage, but it doesn't make a difference now, because those could have been dealt with like we've dealt with terrorists here. We've got all the systems in place. We've got the identification, the assessment process, and we've got the incarceration and the law and legal process that they can go through, and they can be sent to prison or they can go through rehabilitation programs. But those individuals that weren't really a threat will become a threat, and so will their children if we forget them. And I think we're too late now, because we've denied them their human rights. Every Western nation has denied them their human rights. And as a result, we are now allowing the birth of the next nightmare that is going to face not just the UK or Europe, the rest of the world.
Okay, but Hanif, that's a very good way of putting it. Unfortunately, it's not a good thing, because it tells us that there is worse to come. But the question is, most of these foreign fighting, who some of them, of course, some of them were killed. Some of them have gone towards Libya, and then they've gone towards the Sahel. They've become, patched up around the Lake Chad area, fighting for ISIS and all ISIS affiliates. Now the younger generation, which we've spoken about, how do you de-radicalize them? Because some people say, they cannot be de-radicalized. Some people say, this whole de-radicalization thing is a farce. I mean, me and you, we have a different opinion. But can you explain, from your experience, how can somebody be de-radicalized? Because there's a lot of individuals out there who probably need this kind of service.
Of course, there are a lot of opinionated individuals out there, like you said, that disagree with the fact that people can be de-radicalized, or people can't change. Once they become violent or once they have a certain way of thinking, then they can't change. I disagree with that, because you understand, and the others that you've met around in my professional network, we've seen the results of de-radicalization programs work very effectively. Now, it's about being able to engage. First of all, you can't change anybody if you can't engage with them, if you can't reach them, and that doesn't mean just physically reaching them. You have to be able to mentally and ideologically reach them and engage with them in conversation that you either agree and disagree on certain things with them. But the matter is, once you've started to have a dialogue and a conversation, that's not just me talking at somebody, it's me having a debate and a discussion. And often we have to have, some hard hitting facts come out, and sometimes some brutal realities that we have to digest. Some people have said to me that if somebody, like in the government, when we used to work with them, is that, if they're going to talk about Palestine and Israel, then try to avoid that conversation. How can you? How can you avoid the conversation of the weapons of mass destruction, in Iraq, or the annexation of Palestine, or Kashmir, or Czech? You can't avoid those debates because they are facts. And if you try to avoid those debates, then you're not going to address the problem, the root cause, or the grievance. So it's about having those hard discussions, and sometimes accepting defeat, in my opinion, versus their opinion. Maybe I might be educated, but also I may be able to re-educate them on certain facts. And then when it goes down to the ideology, which is being used on Islam, at the end, that's where you have to really come with the hard facts, with the authenticated evidence that they haven't been given. They've probably been given information that they haven't been able to fact check or verify. Our job is to come with that information, with it within context, and with the ability to have it fact checked right there and there in front of them, so that they can rely on the source of that information.
Yeah, thank you, Hanif. Let me come back to Brigadier General because he's back, and then I'll get to you, Mr. Orlando. Brigadier General, Hanif. Yeah, so Brigadier General, let me get this question to you quite quickly. Is the Nigerian army over-promising, or have they been abandoned to fight this war on their own? In terms of interagency and in terms of regional state. But also, one more important question which I want you to touch on. There's a lot of call for the service chiefs to retire. And I have a lot of experience in understanding that in asymmetric warfare, creating relationships even within the military in terms of long-term achievement is important. Is this how you see it?
Yeah, definitely. I think, first and foremost, I don't think the army is taking more than it can chew. Remember, they act on the basis of the evolving threats and, of course, grand strategic directions. And I think so far so good. But I can say, in terms of cooperation and support, if you recall, on Monday, 6 July, I wrote an article in which I raised a lot of questions where people should, statutorily responsible for supporting the Nigerian army, they are not given adequate support as it is, given the prevailing circumstances. And therefore, there is need for it. And I think the army is coping on well, and but there is need for more support, more cooperation, especially within and outside. What I mean by within, as I was talking before the connection went off, it is a collective responsibility. There were instances where the job is no longer that of the military, but that of the police, to administer, because part of it is supposed to be a three-step thing, that when you are able to defeat them, clear the environment, you create an enabling environment for law and order. Of course, the civilian police will take off from there. Then, of course, the Nigerian society itself has a lot of role to play in the sense that they have to understand, what the complexities of fighting insurgency and terrorism. Taking in the fight that, look, the military is there for them, not that it is the Nigerian army or the Nigerian military versus the Boko Haram, because that seems to be the narrative. And a lot of people are just when actually they have a role to play. So we still have to work on that. And talking about regional cooperation, of course, you have seen the multinational joint task force, particularly of the states that make up the Lake Chad Basin Commission. And a Nigerian is heading that place. And they need to really put their act together. Unilateral actions may not solve the problem. And I believe that was the essence of the diplomatic shuttle by the Nigerian president, at the very beginning of formative stage of the multinational joint task force. And we need more of that support we need more of that understanding so that they can collectively deal with the issue. Because if Nigeria is doing it, the Niger Republic, Cameroon, and Chad, to a large extent, even Benin Republic, should be involved so that we can collectively deal with the issue. Because you may chase them from here, they will just change base.
Thank you for that. Mr. Joseph, you had a question for the general, did you? Yeah.
But my question is actually very simple. Let us start with what the brigadier said, that the president, the president promised a lot. He actually said he will destroy Boko Haram within three months of his presidency. I don't know whether I don't know what led him to say so. But let me get to you, because you are a man who understands strategy and propaganda. Let me add that. Why is Boko Haram antagonizing the Nigerian public? It looks like they are very good at social media. They kill one soldier, they blow it up out of proportion. But while you guys are doing great job, you are suppressing them, but we don't hear that information. Is that Boko Haram is outsmarting you in terms of dispersing information?
General, go ahead.
I don't think so. At the initial stage, actually, it was like that. But I knew within the 4 years that I was Director of Army Public Relations, the story changed. Just like I was telling you, we were able to dissect Boko Haram for what it is. And look, Mr. Joseph, in the years gone by, you dare not mention the words Boko Haram in Maiduguri. You refer to them in a Hausa language that Yara Malam, literally translated the children of the teacher. We here, on this part of the climb, we have tremendous respect for the teacher, because the basis for civilization and everything in any given society is from the teacher. So you mentioned them in hushed tones. But I was able to use the media to mention them exactly what they are. In fact, that to a large extent provoked a lot of reaction from the Boko Haram terrorists. And in those days, basically any video they issued out, they always threatened 4 people in this order: President Obama, President Buhari, Lieutenant General Tukur Buratai, and my humble son Usman Kukashika, because I constituted a nightmare to them using the same outlet they were using. Unfortunately, actually, we seem not to sustain the momentum to the point that we would have been on top of the game. But the second reason is simply because initially you are dealing with one single entity, which is Boko Haram terrorist group. But they have splinter group. Now they have international partnership. We even refer to them as ISWAP, and there are elements of ISIS in them. So they brought in sophistication in terms of propaganda, and I believe the military is up and doing because new establishment to deal with that. Now the army has a cyber warfare command and defense space agencies. They are also coming up with issues that will definitely nip all those things in the board, but it's evolving actually.
So this is just a quick one. This is what Mr. Otto and I have been asking these questions. I think you had touched this, the issue of having local knowledge. Mm-hmm. It looks like you are the Nigerian army. You have got the Air Force. You have got the amphibian tracks, whatever it is you want to call them. But yet, these people, Boko Haram to our eyes, they look like thugs. And you wonder, how is that possible? A group like that can actually outmaneuver the army? Do you have, can you actually touch on that? Is it local knowledge that you have to engage with the local people to defeat these groups?
I wish, honestly, Mr. Otto would have answered that question. However, I think they have additional advantage because they are far more familiar with the ground than the Nigerian military or security forces. The security forces and the Nigerian military rely on those
same individual within the environment to provide them information. And
Yeah.
sometimes they trade in the information. And sometimes you understand. So, and some of them have been indoctrinated to the point that they don't see anything wrong that is being done by the Boko Haram. So sometimes they see things that ordinarily they should have taken out, but they don't. And I like the doctrine of when you see something, say something. You know, we are still moving towards that. But by and large, you still have some people that continuously to sympathize and support this guy simply because of religious belief. Because it has been deeply ingrained in their heads that I think is the best way. And thankfully, you have touched on some of this issue of poverty, vulnerability, and what have you. And they kept on, you know, exploiting those situations. And that is why you have this. So it is not an issue of outmaneuvering. And you know, they don't have, you know, the tactics keep on evolving. And Hanif has said a lot of things about, you know, playing into their hands. You know, they once the military get involved and they take advantage of it, just like you say, blow it out of proportion. And unfortunately, there is an average person who think because of political knowledge or because of religious belief, think that anything to do with Islam is a no-go area, that kind of thing. So many things like that. Those are the combination of factors that we had to play with. And I could remember when I was Director of Army Public Relations, there were even a group of people that imported marabouts to come and pray for the continuous sustenance of the Boko Haram terrorists. And when we public, yeah, and there was even a time individuals donated their own biological children to the Boko Haram terrorists, you know, as their contribution to the fight for the sustenance of Islam. And by the time we mention it, some people said we are, you know, making nonsense of their sacrifices because they have been the victims. And we have evidence beyond reasonable doubt that underage girls were being used as suicide bombers. They were donated by their parents. So these are some of the underlying factors that are not visible to the public that kept on not to the fight against terrorism and insurgency.
I think, thank you very much, Mr. So let me just draw this before I get to Mr. Orlando to conclude, because I think it's important for the population to understand that if the military is losing the war, it's because the population is not winning it. You know, the only way you can engage with the military is making sure that the military has the required intelligence. But also one of the things which we always say is that the military needs to develop that trust with the local population, because the local population holds the key. And if you take into context the environment in which Boko Haram operates, if you, for example, you talk about the 2009, between 2009 to 2014, almost anyone who lived in Maiduguri knew somebody who was a member of Boko Haram. Almost anyone who lived in Maiduguri at that point in time, you know, has lost somebody as a result of the Boko Haram crisis. So Boko Haram has actually embedded itself within the local community, and now it needs a lot of time for the local community to be won back, you know, and in order for the military and the other security services to be able to gain some ground. And I'm hopeful that, you know, some of these messages are being taken very seriously, and the army can continuously work on the military and civil relationship. Now, let me also, you know, conclude by, you know, talking to Mr. Orlando, you know, in terms of your own advice. You know, the security industry has changed. You know, the protection of individuals and the protection of properties has really changed, because now we're engaging counterterrorism measures as well. So do you see this as part of what you're currently doing in your training programs?
Yes, so we obviously, as you just mentioned, in everything from the lowest sector within security to the highest sector as in close protection, we have to involve and take that as part of the threat assessments that we do. Okay. It's part of what our daily runs are. working within the event industry, working in your normal security, day-to-day security industry. It has to be a part of it because of the asymmetry of it. So we have to take considerations to all of that. We have to start making plans. And as the 5 Ps would say, planning and preparation prevents poor performance. So we have to put that in place and plan, organize ourselves, and do runs sometimes, just do dry runs. What would you do if this should happen? And deal with it from that perspective. In terms of protecting yourself, it's very hard, but if you should find yourself in that situation where you are being attacked by a knife, just protect you, run if you can. That's the best and for first and foremost thing. And if you should be within that situation where you can't run and you have to protect yourself, it's hard to show on screen, but we try to protect yourself from a knife perspective, getting cuts from the outside, not from the inside.
And how can you be contacted if somebody wants this kind of training programs? Is it possible for somebody to reach you?
Yes, they can touch base with me through my email address. I don't know if saying it out loud or it can be put up on the program afterwards.
Yes, you can.
Yeah, it's info@psa-academy.com.
Okay. And then we come to Hanif, because you and I have been. I want you to conclude on this program because we've got about 3 minutes left. Hanif, what is your advice? I mean, we've got these recent attacks on lockdown measures. What is your advice to governments that are facing sleeper cells, people that live within communities that is difficult to identify? How do you root them out? What is your last? I mean, not your last, but how would you go about this? I mean.
So, thank you. I'm sorry about that last few minutes. Look, the pre-COVID, it was a different ballgame. We're now in a different environment, completely different ballgame, and we're operating in a post-COVID world where prevent and CVE is becoming much more of a challenge because we don't have those engagement tools available to us. We don't have those identification tools. All of those. Assessment frameworks and all of those, methods and modes of operation have gone out the window because teachers don't have access to all of the pupils. Doctors don't have the right kind of access. There's no face-to-face interactions. It's all moved away. People have been isolated and have been alienated. And as a fact, because of all of the nonsense that's going around COVID and the conspiracy theories, it's pushed people further away from mainstream engagement, and it's pushed them into an environment where we cannot control the circumstances or the narrative. So the greatest challenge now is how do we, and this is maybe a discussion that me and you need to have aside from this, is to come up, and I was speaking to somebody today about what's the next best way forward and what would I advise governments? Well, governments need to find a way of engaging with the target, or like with the human resource that we talked about before. Mm-hmm. We need to find a new way of engagement. We need to find a way of occupying the space and removing some of the nonsense and the crap and the conspiracy theories that people are internalizing and becoming more radicalized as a result. So, and there are ways of doing that. We just need to find that. And I don't think the government has explored that. And if they don't look at this new challenge and evolve, like I've said many times, David, when we met, and also in the book that I've written, is that extremists and terrorists, they evolve rapidly and it always change and adapt to the rapid change in circumstances and in society. We, on the other hand, governments don't do the same kind of adaptation, or they don't evolve as quickly as they should towards the new kind of threat. We need to now come up with a plan on how we can continue the engagement, outreach and engagement and the conversation with the target audience in a post-COVID era. This is something that me and you can talk about and put something together, because I think the government, not just this government, I think other governments haven't considered. And because they haven't considered that, the threat picture is, I would say, many people have said it to me, that what does the number of post Reading and Glasgow? What does the number of radicalized people look like? And I would say, I can bet you it's huge.
Perfect.
And we can't put a number to that, but I think it's something that governments need to look at, but also other people like me and you need to look at, and ways of coming together to provide a proposal and a working model to give to governments around the world.
Thank you, Hanif. Let me conclude with General here. General, we've got the COVID-19 era. I want you to conclude on this. You're no longer a general. But you've retired now. How would you advise the army to adapt to this new, COVID-19 era, where you've got, a change of circumstances? Has the army adapted? Anything that you can say about that to conclude this program?
Well, I will still refer back to that program. I mean, the article I wrote on Monday.
Yes.
July 6th. I have devoted a paragraph in which I commended what the Nigerian army did, because, they had barracks across the 36 states of the Federation, including the Federal Capital Territory, not minding the number of operational bases they have. And so far, we have not had any single case of outbreak of the pandemic in the barracks or any one of their operational bases. That is a plus to them, because they have taken proactive measures to prevent that. To what extent they will sustain that is left to be seen. I would rather encourage and support them in that regard, and they should do more. I think they are far ahead of other institutions in terms of dealing with this pandemic, in terms of prevention and observing the protocol. And so far, so good.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, General. I appreciate your contributions. Brigadier General retired Sandy Kukasheka. I also appreciate the presence of Orlando Matna. You guys have been very, very great. Mr. Hanif Kadi, who is a violent extremist consultant. I thank you guys very much for your immense knowledge on this subject. Definitely, I have to bring you again, because we couldn't have enough of you. You guys, your knowledge is so vast and vast, and we need to get you back so we can talk on some of the issues that you've not been able to talk about. The audience would like to hear more from you guys. I want to thank the Africans in London TV, Mr. Joseph. Thank you so much, and over to you.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, and those who have been watching, the conversation does not stop here. It continues online. This video will be available on YouTube, but as we speak, it has been live on Facebook. As you know, every Thursday from 6 p.m. Today we started a little bit late. As we know, technology is always challenging us, but we don't want to be bound by it. You have heard all the experts talking about what they know. Next week, same time, we are going to come again fully fledged. Mr. Otto will be here again with another set of experts. Now you understand. Now you understand the challenges of the Nigerian army. They've been going through, and they are going through with Boko Haram. Probably next time, Mr. Otto will be talking about Somali or whatever. So until then, thank you for watching, and thank you for listening, and thank you for the participants. Thank you. See you next time.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye,
Bye.
gentlemen.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great pleasure.